morning her father left. The sky was the color of a bruise. Clara Weston stood on the cracked wooden porch of the house she had grown up in, the one with the peeling white paint and the screen door that never latched right, and she watched his truck disappear down the dirt road without once slowing down. No brake lights, no hesitation, just a slow swallow of dust rising behind a tailgate until there was nothing left but the flat, indifferent horizon of eastern Kansas stretching out forever in every direction. She was 23 years old. She had $48 in her checking account, 3 boxes of her belongings stacked in the hallway, and a mother 2 years in the ground. The neighbors would talk. They already were. She had seen the way Marge Pulliam at the feed store looked at her the week before. That particular mix of pity and satisfaction that small towns reserve for families coming apart at the seams. She had heard the whispers at the gas station. Earl Weston finally walked. Left that girl with nothing, same as his father before him, as if leaving were a thing passed down in the blood, like a color or a weak heart. Clara did not cry. Not then. She had already spent her tears somewhere between her mother's funeral and the morning she found the eviction notice folded on the front doormat, placed there, she supposed, so the neighbors wouldn't see it. A small mercy from a merciless situation. She sat down on the porch steps and looked out at the land. The fields around the house were dry and colorless, the late September grass gone to straw, the old fence posts leaning at tired angles like men who had been standing too long. A hawk turned slow circles high up in the pale sky. The wind moved through the dead cornstalks in the field across the road with a sound like paper tearing. She had 2 weeks before she had to be gone. It was her neighbor, old Dale Briggs, who told her about the Harmon place. He came over that same afternoon in his mud-spattered Chevy, his boots trailing red clay across her porch, his hat in his hands the way men in that part of the country held their hats when they were about to say something serious. He told her the Harmon farm had been sitting empty going on 4 years. 70 acres, a falling-down barn, a farmhouse that needed more work than a person could count, and a pen full of pigs, 12 of them, that old Gerald Harmon's nephew had no interest in and no patience for. Banks tired of carrying it, Dale said. Might let it go for next to nothing if somebody showed up willing. Clara looked at him for a long moment. I don't know anything about pigs, she said. Dale put his hat back on his head. Gerald didn't either. First year. Figured it out. He left her with a phone number written on the back of a seed catalog receipt. She held that little scrap of paper in both hands as the sun went down and the crickets started up in the dry grass and the sky turned that deep, aching orange that only exists over the open plains, the kind of color that makes a person feel both very small and very alive at the same time. She made the call the next morning. What happened after that would take everything she had, and then ask for more. Before we go further, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This story was made for people who believe in starting over. The Harmon place was worse than Dale had described, and Dale had not described it kindly. Clara drove out to see it on a Thursday morning, the kind of October morning in Kansas, where the cold hasn't fully arrived yet, but the warmth has already packed its bags and left. The sky was high and white. The road leading to the property was little more than 2 tire tracks pressed into red clay, bordered on both sides by dead sunflowers still standing at full height, brown and skeletal, their heads drooping like they were ashamed of something. She parked at the gate and sat in her car for a long moment before getting out. The farmhouse stood at the end of a short gravel path, a 2-story structure that had once been white and was now the color of old bone. The porch sagged on one side. 2 upstairs windows were cracked, one of them patched with a piece of cardboard and electrical tape. The yard was all dried mud and volunteer weeds, and a rusted water pump stood near the side of the house, like a monument to something that had stopped working a long time ago. The barn behind the house had lost a third of its roof on the eastern side. Corrugated metal sheets lay buckled in the grass nearby, edges curled up by some long-ago storm. The wood of the barn walls had gone silver-gray from years of sun and weather, and in certain places the boards had warped away from the frame, leaving long dark gaps that the wind moved through with a low, mournful sound. And the pigs, 12 of them, in a pen constructed of hog wire and old wooden posts on the south side of the barn. They heard her come before she reached them and set up a noise that seemed too large for 12 animals. A deep, communal grunt that rose and fell like a conversation in a language she didn't speak. They pressed against the wire as she approached, their small dark eyes watching her with an intelligence that made her uncomfortable. They were thin, not starving, but close enough to it that she could see the architecture of their ribs when they moved. Someone had been coming out to feed them. She learned later it was Dale, quietly, without being asked, but not enough, and not with any love in it. She stood at the wire and looked at them, and they looked back at her. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said aloud. One of the pigs, a large reddish sow near the back of the group, lifted her snout and made a sound that was almost conversational. Clara almost laughed. Almost. The bank officer, a thin man named Garrett with wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful manner of someone who delivered bad news for a living, met her at the property that afternoon. The price he named was low enough to be possible, as she used every cent of the small life insurance policy her mother had left her and took on a modest loan besides. The loan, he explained with some delicacy, would be difficult given her employment history. She had been working part-time at a grocery warehouse in Salina for the past year. Before that, she had stayed home to help care for her mother through the illness. Her credit file was thin as paper. "I can make it work," she said. Garrett looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man who had heard those words before and watched them fail. But there were forms, there were signatures. And 3 weeks later, after phone calls she made standing in the parking lot of the warehouse because she was ashamed to make them inside, Clara Weston drove her pack car down that red clay road for the first time as the person the deed said she was. Owner. The word felt foreign. It felt terrifying. It felt, underneath all of that, like the first solid thing she had touched in years. She carried her boxes inside as the sun dropped low and the shadow of the old barn stretched long across the yard. The farmhouse smelled of dust and mouse droppings and something older, wood and time and the accumulated weight of other people's lives. She set her boxes in the front room and stood in the middle of the floor and listened to the silence of the place. It was not an empty silence. It was a silence of something waiting. She just didn't know yet what it was waiting for, or whether it was waiting to help her or to swallow her whole. The first month nearly broke her, not in one dramatic moment. The way breaking happens in movies. It happened the way real breaking happens. Slowly, incrementally, in the accumulation of small disasters that each seemed manageable alone, but together formed a weight that pressed down on the chest from the moment she opened her eyes in the morning. The farmhouse had no functioning heat. The propane tank was empty, and the quote she got from the gas company in town was more than she could spend without compromising the feed budget. She found an old wood stove in the back room, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor in 3 sections, and she spent 2 days watching YouTube videos on her phone, propped against a coffee on the kitchen counter, learning how to reassemble and seal it. She burned her forearm on the pipe the first time she fired it up. She did not tell anyone. The pigs required feeding twice a day, every day, without exception. She had read everything she could find, library books, extension office pamphlets, online forums where hog farmers from Iowa and Missouri argue with each other about feed ratios with the passion of men debating religion. She learned that her animals were a mixed herd, mostly Yorkshire and Duroc crosses, and that they were behind on their weight for their age. She adjusted their feed. She learned to move among them without flinching, which took longer than she expected. The large reddish sow she had noticed on her first visit, the one who had seemed to answer her, she named Ruby. It was the first name she gave any of them. The others followed gradually. She drove into the nearest town, a place called Millhaven, population just over 2,000, once a week for supplies. The town had a feed store, a diner, a Dollar General, a barbershop, and a grain elevator that dominated the skyline, the way a cathedral might in another kind of place. People knew who she was before she introduced herself. That was the nature of small towns. They knew she had bought the Harmon place. They knew about her father. Some of them had known her mother. The feed store was run by a man named Harv Cully, broad-shouldered and laconic, who watched her load 50-pound bags into the back of her car without offering to help the first 2 times she came in. The 3rd time, he came around the counter and lifted a bag without a word and set it in her trunk. She thanked him. He nodded and went back inside. It was the closest thing to welcome she received in those early weeks. The women at the diner were more complicated. There were 3 of them who seemed to run the place by collective authority. Norma, who owned it, and 2 sisters named Patty and June who had worked there so long the distinction between staff and ownership had blurred into irrelevance. They were not unkind, exactly, but they watched her with the careful attention that rural communities reserve for newcomers and returnees alike. People who might stay and become part of the fabric of a place, or might leave and confirm every suspicion about outsiders and youth and the general unreliability of people who didn't have deep roots in the county clay. Clara did not try to win them over. She didn't have the energy. She ate her lunch at the counter when she came in, always the same thing, the daily special, because it was the cheapest full meal on the menu, and she answered questions when asked and didn't offer more than was wanted. She was too tired for performance, because the nights were the hardest part. After the pigs were fed and the stove was stoked in the farmhouse, it settled into a particular evening silence. Clara would sit at the kitchen table under the single overhead bulb that buzzed faintly when the wind moved outside, and she would look at her notebook. The spiral-bound one she used to track feed costs and animal weights and repair estimates, and the numbers would stare back at her with the cold neutrality of mathematics. She was 3 months from the point where the money ran out, 3 months to make something grow or watch everything collapse. She thought about her father on those nights, though she tried not to. She thought about the way he had looked the last few years, hollowed out, bitter, full of resentment she had never fully understood, but had always lived inside like weather. She wondered where he was. She did not wonder if he thought about her. She already knew the answer to that, and the knowing was a specific kind of pain she had learned to breathe around, the way you learn to breathe around a bruised rib. One night, late in November, a cold front pushed down from the north, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours. She went out to check on the pigs in the dark, her flashlight cutting a pale beam through air that tasted like iron. The animals were huddled together in a far corner of the shelter, a lean-to she had reinforced with salvage plywood and old feed sacks, their breath rising in small white clouds. Ruby was standing apart from the others. Clara held the flashlight closer and saw immediately that something was wrong. If you've ever had to figure things out completely alone, comment below. You are not the only one. Ruby was in labor. Clara had not known she was pregnant. That fact landed on her in the cold dark of the lean-to with a particular kind of humiliation. The humiliation of realizing how much she still did not know, how many things she had not thought to check, how many ways this whole endeavor could unravel, because of the gap in her knowledge that an experienced farmer would have caught in the first week. She knelt in the straw beside the sow and tried to remember everything she had read. Ruby was breathing hard, her sides heaving with a slow and labored rhythm, her eyes moving with that deep animal seriousness that has no equivalent in human expression. There was no panic in her, only effort, only the enormous, focused work of bringing something into the world. Clara went back to the house and got every clean towel she owned. She got the bottle of iodine from the first aid kit under the sink. She got her phone and propped in the straw and pulled up every resource she could find, reading fast in the cold light of the screen while her breath made clouds in the air around her. She stayed in that lean-to for 6 hours. By the time the sky began to go gray in the east, Ruby had delivered 9 piglets. 7 of them were alive and nursing. 2 had not made it, one born still, one that seemed to breathe for a few minutes, and then did not. Clara had held that second one in her gloved hands and felt its small warmth go out at the way a coal goes dark, and something about that particular helplessness, the inability to save a thing despite being present, despite trying, reached down into a part of her she had been keeping carefully sealed and opened it without asking permission. She cried then, kneeling in the straw in the gray Kansas dawn with the surviving piglets making their small urgent sounds, and Ruby breathing slow and steady beside her. She cried the way she had not cried since her mother's last days, long and hard and without dignity. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her wrist and looked at the 7 living animals pushing and rooting in the straw. 7 new lives on her land. She named none of them that morning. She was too exhausted and too superstitious about naming things she might lose. But she put her hand flat against Ruby's broad, warm side and felt the sow breathe and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "We're going to be all right." She didn't fully believe it yet, but she said it. Word of what she was doing out at the Harmon place traveled through Millhaven the way all things traveled through small towns, selectively, partially, and with additions. By December, people knew she was raising hogs alone. Some people found this admirable. Others found it foolish. A few found it threatening in a way they couldn't quite articulate. A young woman doing something without a man's name attached to it, without a father or a husband standing at the edge of the frame, giving the enterprise legitimacy. The trouble came from a man named Denton Crace. Crace owned the 200 acres adjacent to the Harmon property on the north side, and he had been farming that land and his family's land before for 30 years with the particular authority of a man who has never seriously been challenged. He was not a villain in the simple sense. He was something more complicated and more common, a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that his way of doing things was not merely his preference but the correct order of the world, and who experienced any deviation from that order as a personal affront. He came to her property for the first time on a cold December afternoon, driving a newer truck than she would ever be able to afford, and he stood at her fence line with his arms crossed and told her that the drainage from her pig pen was running onto his property after the rains and that she needed to correct it. Clara walked the fence line with him and looked at the ground and saw that he was not entirely wrong. There was a low point where water collected and moved northward. She acknowledged it. "I'll regrade in spring," she said. "Ground's frozen now." "I'd like it done sooner," Crace said. "I understand that," Clara said. Spring. He looked at her the way certain men look at women who decline to be managed. A look that moves through surprise and settles into something colder. "Your father and I had an understanding about this property," he said. It was a deliberate thing to say. He knew it was. He watched her face for the flinch. Clara looked at him steadily. "My father doesn't own this property," she said. "I do." Crace left without another word. But as his truck moved back down the road, she had a distinct and certain feeling that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning. What she didn't know. What she couldn't have known standing there in the December cold with her boots in the frozen mud, was that Denton Crace had been waiting for the Harmon property for years, and that her presence on it was not merely an inconvenience. It was an obstacle. Lee would like to help this story reach more people who need to hear it. January arrived like a verdict. The temperature dropped to single digits and stayed there for 11 days without relief. The dirt road to the property turned to iron. The water lines to the pig pen froze twice, and Clara spent 2 mornings with a heat gun borrowed from Dale Briggs, working the pipes back to life with her fingers going numb inside her gloves and the wind cutting across the open fields with ferocity that felt personal. The wood stove consumed cord after cord of the wood she had spent October splitting and stacking, and by the middle of the month she was rationing heat the way people ration food in hard times, keeping the kitchen and 1 bedroom livable, letting the rest of the house go cold. She lost 4 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. She stopped looking in mirrors. But the piglets grew. All 7 of Ruby's surviving offspring were thriving by January's end, compact and loud and perpetually hungry, with the reckless energy of young things that have no memory of cold or scarcity. She had acquired 3 additional sows in December through a private sale she'd found posted on a board outside the Millhaven feed store. Older animals, proven breeders, sold by a retiring farmer in the next county, who had looked at her across his kitchen table with the evaluating eyes of a man who had spent 50 years reading the weather and said, "Simply, you've got the right kind of stubborn for this work." She had driven home with the animals in a borrowed trailer, feeling something she was almost afraid to call pride. The herd was growing. The weight charts in her notebook were moving in the right direction. She had made contact with a regional pork cooperative 2 counties north and had a preliminary conversation about supplying them by late spring if her numbers held. The man she spoke to on the phone, a practical, efficient voice named Marcus who seemed to evaluate everything in pounds and price per hundredweight, had not dismissed her. He had asked precise questions. She had answered them precisely. He told her to call back in February with updated figures. She circled that date and read in her notebook and looked at it every morning. It was Dale who told her about the zoning complaint. He came over on a Saturday morning in early February, stomping snow off his boots on her porch, his face arranged in a careful, neutral expression of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. Someone had filed a complaint with the county zoning office alleging that her operation exceeded the permitted livestock density for a property of her acreage classification, and that the waste management setup was inadequate under state agricultural guidelines. The complaint was anonymous. Clara stood in her kitchen doorway and listened and kept her face very still. "It's Crace," she said. Dale didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either. He looked at his boots. "County's going to send an inspector out. Could take 2, 3 weeks to schedule. In the meantime, the complaint's on record. Can he shut me down?" "Not directly. Not yet. But if the inspector finds violations, real or otherwise, they can issue a corrective order. Give you 30 days. If you can't comply in 30 days," he stopped. "They can pull my operating permit," Clara finished. Dale nodded slowly. "There's also the matter of the cooperative. Something like a county complaint on record, even unresolved, might give them reason to pause on bringing you in." Clara turned and walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the pig pen. The animals were moving in their slow morning way, the older sows methodical and deliberate, the young ones chasing each other with pointless enthusiasm around the perimeter of the enclosure. Ruby stood near the gate, watching the house the way she always did, as if keeping track of Clara specifically. She thought about Denton Crace in his newer truck with his crossed arms and his careful mention of her father. She thought about the way power works in small places, not through force exactly, but through the slow application of process, paperwork, legitimacy weaponized against people who have less time and less money to fight it. She thought about her mother, who had spent 20 years accommodating people who should have been stood up to. She thought about her father, who had spent 20 years running from everything that required him to stay. She was not her mother. She was not her father. "I need to see the actual guidelines," she said. "The specific state regulations. Every number, every measurement, every requirement." Dale looked at her with something shifting in his expression, some recalibration happening behind his eyes. "Clara," he said carefully, "even if you're fully compliant, and I think you probably are, fighting this is going to cost you time and money you might not have, and Crace knows that. That might be the whole point." "I know," she said. She turned from the window. "I need the regulations, Dale." He studied her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set a folded printout on her kitchen table. "Already pulled them," he said. "Figured you want them." She looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. "You drove out here this morning to give me those." "Roads weren't that bad," he said, and picked up his hat. After he left, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the regulations spread out before her and her notebook open beside them, and she began to go through everything line by line. The light outside was the flat white of a February mid-morning in Kansas. No warmth in it, no promise, just illumination, just enough to see by. She measured, she calculated, she cross-referenced, and somewhere in the third hour of reading, she found something, not a violation on her part. Something else entirely. Comment below. Would you have the courage to do what she did? Be honest. The document was a county land use record from 2019. Clara had found it buried in the state agricultural database, while cross-referencing the zoning complaint against her property's official classification. It was a variance application, a formal request filed with the county to reclassify the northern boundary of the Harmon property. The application had been submitted by Denton Crace. It had been denied, but the record of it told her something important. something that made her sit very still at her kitchen table in the February cold with her pencil suspended above her notebook. Crace had tried to acquire the reclassification of her land before Gerald Harmon's death, before the bank took it, before anyone knew it would go to auction. He had been positioning himself to absorb those 70 acres into his operation for years, moving through official channels with the patient confidence of a man who expected the system to eventually deliver what he wanted. The Harmon place was not just adjacent land to Crace. It was a specific piece of geography, the lowest point in a natural watershed that drained across 3 properties in the area. Whoever controlled those 70 acres controlled the water flow for the entire northern section of the township, in a state where drought years came with increasing frequency, where aquifer levels were a subject of anxious conversation at every feed store counter and diner booth. That kind of leverage was not abstract. It was a difference between a farm that survived hard years and one that didn't. Clara had not bought a failing pig farm. She had bought, without knowing it, the most strategically significant piece of agricultural land in her corner of Millhaven County. And Denon Crace knew it. She drove to the county seat on a Monday morning, 60 miles on roads that were still edged with February ice. She brought her notebook, the regulatory printout Dale had given her, the land use records she had printed at the library, and every document relating to her property that she owned. She wore her cleanest clothes and her mother's old wool coat, and she arrived at the County Agricultural Extension Office when it opened at 8 in the morning. The extension agent was a woman named Roberta Sims, 50s efficient, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the manner of someone who had seen every variety of rural dispute and retained her patience through all of them. Clara laid her documents on the desk and walked her through everything: the complaint, the regulations, her compliance measurements, every distance, every calculation, every figure confirmed against the state guidelines, and then the land use variance application from 2019. Roberta Sims read in silence for a long time. "You're not in violation," she said finally. "Your density numbers are within range, and your drainage setup, while basic, meets minimum code." "I know," Clara said. "I want that on record before the inspector comes." Roberta looked at her over her glasses. "That's smart. And the variance application?" Roberta was quiet for a moment. "That's a matter of public record. Anyone can see it. Whether it's relevant to your situation," she paused, choosing her words with care, "depends on whether someone wanted to make it relevant." Clara looked at her steadily. "I want to make it relevant." What followed took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of phone calls and formal responses, and a meeting with the county commissioner that Dale drove her to without being asked. 6 weeks during which the inspector came, walked the property, asked his questions, and filed a report that found no substantive violations, only a recommendation for minor drainage improvements she had already begun. 6 weeks during which she called Marcus at the cooperative every Friday with her updated figures, and Marcus, who had heard something through the agricultural network about the complaint and the inspection, and the young woman who had documented herself into compliance, began responding with increasing interest. Crace did not file a second complaint. Whether it was a public record of the variance application, now discussed openly at the Millhaven Diner, brought up at a township meeting Clara did not attend, but heard about in detail, or simply the calculation that she was not going to be moved, she never knew for certain. She suspected it was both. The cooperative agreement came through on a Thursday in late March. Clara was in the pig pen when her phone rang, standing in the mud with her boots sunk an inch deep, scratching Ruby behind one ear while the sow made her low, contented sound. She answered with her free hand and listened to Marcus lay out the terms, and she said yes to everything reasonable and negotiated 2 things that weren't. And when she hung up, she stood for a moment in the pale spring light with her hand still resting on Ruby's broad, warm back. The fields around her were beginning to show the first faint green of early growth. The sky was that particular blue that only appears over plains in late March, deep and clear, and so vast it makes the chest ache. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the fence row, that bright cascading song that means winter is finished, that the hard season is past. She had 47 animals on her land. She had a cooperative contract. She had a roof that she had partially re-shingled herself on a series of cold November weekends, and a wood stove that worked, and a notebook full of figures that were moving in the right direction. She had a neighbor who drove 60 miles with her without being asked, and a feed store owner who had started, sometime around January, to have her order ready when she arrived. She did not have her father. She had stopped waiting for him to come back. That door, the one she had left quietly open in the back of herself, the one that faces a road and watches for headlights, she had finally, deliberately closed it, not with anger, with something quieter and more final, with the understanding that some people cannot stay, and that their leaving, as devastating as it is, does not determine what you become. What determines what you become is what you do in the space they leave behind. That spring evening, as the sun went down over the Kansas plains and the sky turned that deep, burning orange, the color of something ending and something beginning simultaneously, Clara Weston sat on the porch steps of the farmhouse that was hers, on the land that was hers, and she opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a single word. Not a name, not a number, not a calculation. Forward. Then she closed the notebook and listened to the meadowlark and let the last of the light go. If you like stories from the countryside like this one, stories about real people, real land, and real courage, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are more stories like Clara's waiting to be told. And before you go, comment below and tell us, what would you have left behind to start over the way she did? This story was made for everyone who ever stood at the edge of something broken and chose to build.